Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so in this episode, I want to try to say something about the oldest story in the world, Gilgamesh. So, if you don't know, let me try to give you a brief summary. And here I'm skipping over many things just to give the gist of it. Okay, so the story is about the king of Uruk, Gilgamesh. Now what happens is that after his best friend, Enkidu, dies, for the first time in his life, Gilgamesh realizes that he too is mortal. And this really scares him. So what he does is he sets out on a journey to discover the secret of immortality. He heads out to the edge of the world to find Utanapishtim, a legendary hero who has obtained eternal life. It turns out, though, that Gilgamesh ultimately fails in his quest for everlasting life and eventually has to return home to Uruk. Okay, so in this episode, what I want to try to explore is what it is, if anything, Gilgamesh ultimately learns. Was his trip a failure, or does it teach him something? When he finally returns home, after having stared into the deep, and after having failed to achieve immortality, what kind of consolation does he get, if any? What kind of lessons does he learn? What kind of wisdom does he acquire? Well, I think that there's just so much to say here. So I would say that even though Gilgamesh fails to get the everlasting life that he wanted, he actually does learn quite a bit and finds consolation in several important ways. Okay, so first of all, let's go back to the beginning of the story and notice something very important. Let's remember just how restless Gilgamesh was and how hyper-driven he was to get out of there and to achieve things, immortality among them, of course. I mean, even Gilgamesh's mother notices this. This is what she says. She says, "He has a restless heart that will not sleep." So Gilgamesh is, at the start of all of this, unbounded energy, driven by the desire for fame and immortality. But here's the thing. I think you could argue that his restlessness and his energy is not driven by inspiration. Rather, I think that what fuels all of it is an underlying desperation. You know, it's interesting. The French thinker, Montaigne, who knew what it was like to live in an agitated and restless age, says that our restlessness is driven by our conscious or unconscious obsession with mortality. This is why we, Gilgamesh included probably, this is why we have all of these desires for things that exceed the confines of our mortal life. This is why, preoccupied with the future, we're never happy in the moment, in the present. In other words, we are never really at home, but always beyond, says Montaigne. For Montaigne, what we need to do is we need to learn to cultivate the art of being at home if we want to achieve genuine contentment. Now, okay, how do we do this then? Well, we must learn to circumscribe and restrain our desires to the nearest, the most contiguous good things. We must limit our aspirations to the parameters of our mortal lives. Or more simply, maybe, and this is something that Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked about, we must remember what it's like to take pleasure in just being alive, in the sweet sentiment of existence, as he called it. where we think neither of the past nor of the future, but simply exult in the goodness of being itself. Now again, here's the thing. For most of the story, Gilgamesh clearly fails to recognize any of these sorts of things. Even near the end of his travels, when he meets Siduri, the tavern keeper, who advises him in the same way that Montaigne would, to give up his search for immortality and instead go home and enjoy life locally, Gilgamesh is described as pacing around and inattentive and restless in his unhappiness. Now, it's only when he's categorically denied any prospects for immortality by Uttanapishtim that he is finally freed from his restless heart. And it's only then, when he has absorbed the deeper wisdom of accepting reality, that he can finally find rest and therefore return to the place he started from. But this time, fully living at home, in the present, and not beyond. Okay, so I think that's one lesson that he learned. But there's much more to say here, I think. And it's connected to what I just said. So, yes, Gilgamesh is, at the end of the story, freed from his pathological restlessness. But that said, I don't think that we should imagine his life back in Uruk as one that's now going to be marked by total leisure or serenity. In other words, ultimately, I don't think it's some sort of a Edenic state that he's after. Since I think that he realizes eventually that that's not the kind of thing that will provide him with meaning and consolation. In fact, it seems to me that Gilgamesh gets a sense that this is the case when he first encounters Uttanapishtim. I mean, it's really interesting that apart from its location at the farthest edges of the world, Uttanapishtim and his wife's environment is entirely without description in the story. In other words, this place of immortality, as coveted as it is by all from afar, is actually completely without character and distinction, without, paradoxically, much life at all. To be sure, in their Eden, Uttanapishtim and his wife get their peace and their leisure. But here's the question. At what price? Well, seemingly at the price of, loneliness and sterility and immobilization. And would one expect otherwise? After all, how can one make sense of things like motivation and passion and action and setting goals and then achieving them in a world where one lives forever? Why bother to do anything now when one can always do it later? In this sense, immortality is stultifying and inimical to action. Sure, we all say that we want our Edens, right? And the immortality and the perpetual leisure and serenity that characterizes them. But when it comes down to it, we actually really don't want it. I mean, here's an example. Think about Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey, who rejects the opportunity for immortality for himself and for an eternal relationship with an ageless, transcendentally beautiful goddess who will never stop desiring him, and all of this on an island whose beauty has no rival in all of Western literature. Now, why does he reject all this? You know why? Because he'd rather go home to Ithaca to be with his mortal, aging wife. You see, Calypso's paradise might offer infinite ease and leisure, but it does so at the cost of attachments to the finite but very real world. For Odysseus to exile himself with her, with this goddess, is for him to deprive himself of both the cares and the tribulations of the very real human life he left behind. A life of caring for his wife and his family and his homeland. Anyway, all of this is just to say that maybe immortality in paradise isn't all that it's cracked up to be, and that this is something Gilgamesh eventually begins to understand. Maybe he begins to understand that an unquiet heart is natural and even a good thing, so long as what it aches for is love for the things of this finite world and for those everyday constructive acts that help to build it. Maybe another way of putting this is that what Gilgamesh ultimately comes to understand is that it's not individual immortality, but rather his everyday earthly projects and the care and the management of his home and his city, Uruk, that provide him with some meaning and reassurance. Actually, Voltaire says as much in his novel Candide. What we should do, all we can do, at the end of the day, he says, is tend to the cultivation of our little gardens. Okay, but now I mentioned consolation earlier, right? I asked whether or not Gilgamesh gets any consolation despite failing at his quest for becoming immortal. Well, okay, I think there is some consolation. And I think this comes from that clay tablet that we're told about in the prologue, on which he or another poet of his time has written or carved his story into. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, okay, so Camus, in his book The Rebel, argues that when we write stories, in Gilgamesh's case, his own, what we're doing is we're rectifying or transfiguring reality in certain ways. What he means is that writers, in drawing from the reality of their lives, they choose and select and highlight what is most important, and then they neglect what is not, and then go on to give their stories a kind of unity and completion that reality lacks. I mean, think about it. What was Gilgamesh's life actually like? If Gilgamesh or anyone around him at the time were to try to simply describe the reality of his life, what we would be left with are largely disordered and often very mundane and certainly incomplete bits of content. But by fashioning his life into a story, into a narrative, Gilgamesh is able to provide connections and destinies and resolutions in his life that otherwise wouldn't have been there, at least not clearly so. As Camus might say, he's able to complete things that in real life he could never consummate. So it's in this way then. It's by turning his life into something coherent and meaningful, into a work of art, that I think Gilgamesh is provided with another form of consolation. Okay, but there's even another form of consolation that Gilgamesh gets, I think. It's this. It's by writing his story down, by turning it into a work of art. He memorializes his life and therefore gives it a kind of immortality it, of course, could never have had if simply lived out. In other words, he realizes his life will end, but that his story doesn't have to. You know, Plato, in fact, says as much in his great dialogue, the Symposium. What he says there is that there are essentially two ways of going about achieving immortality. So the first, of course, is through having biological children of your own. In passing on your genes to them, you of course pass on a part of yourself into future generations. Okay, but despite its popularity, Plato thinks that this is a kind of second grade or inferior way of going about trying to achieve immortality. No, the best way is to give birth not to children, but to great works of art. Call these your spiritual children as opposed to your biological ones. Now, these kind of children, he thinks, will live longer than your biological descendants will. In fact, you know what? Plato's own writings are a testament to this. His children are still alive and well today, 2,300 years after his death. So the point is that this is what Gilgamesh has done. In having his story written down, the oldest story that we have in the world, he has immortalized himself through literature. That's consolation. Okay, so I want to talk about one last thing that I think Gilgamesh finally learns. But for this, I got to go back a bit and describe Gilgamesh's meeting with the mysterious tavern keeper, Siduri. Okay, so in his search for eternal life, Gilgamesh comes across this mysterious Siduri, who lives on the shore of the cosmic ocean. Now, when he tells her of his mission to get eternal life, what she says to him is that what he's doing is futile, and that he's chasing after the wind. And instead, what she says to him is this. She says, "You, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full. Keep enjoying yourself day and night. Every day make merry and dance and play. Let your cloth be clean. Let your head be washed. May you be bathed in water. Gaze on the little one who holds your hand. Let a wife enjoy your repeated embrace. Such is the destiny of mortal man." Okay, now it's really interesting. Scholars have long since noticed something. They've noticed an absolutely striking parallel between Siduri's speech here and what's said in Ecclesiastes, a book of the Old Testament. I mean, there, in Ecclesiastes, after stating that everything done under the sun is essentially chasing after the wind, the author goes on to say this. He says, "Go, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart. Always let your garments be white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife that you love, all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun." Now, setting aside the interesting question of literary dependence, the message both in Ecclesiastes and from Siduri and Gilgamesh is pretty clear, isn't it? That is, that enjoying everyday life, our loved ones, and our work is the best answer possible to the problem of mortality. After all, food and drink and love are God's gifts, Ecclesiastes tells us. And what else is the message here? Well, it's that we shouldn't spend too much time thinking about matters above the sun, as Gilgamesh spent much of his time trying to do. No, this constant yearning for transcendence eclipses the light of the moment, the most precious thing that we have. And anyway, matters above the sun are not within our reach, and certainly beyond our knowledge. And really, the message is this. It's that we shouldn't think, again, like Gilgamesh did, that for our efforts and achievements to be valuable and meaningful, that they must be preserved forever in some durational sense. As Aristotle reminded us, a white thing which lasts for a long time is no whiter than that which lasts a single day. I mean, think about it. If the length of time is the only important measure of value to us, without which life is worthless, then surely we must admit that finite life is worthless anyway, no? So the higher wisdom is clear. We should accept our finitude and make the most out of a life that will take everything away from us. And now we're ready. Now we should take a good look around and see it all again for the very first time. And see how beautiful and shining it all is. These walls whose ramparts gleam like copper in the sun. Bye for now.